Empathy really is the starting point of a lot of other important work.
Like, that's the stuff to me that I felt has been actually super critical.
There's perhaps an assumption that empathy is about being friends with everybody. I don't need to do that in order to do my job.
For those who say your feelings and emotion doesn't really matter, I think that's more of a defense mechanism to bypass the reality that feelings and emotion does matter, because we're human beings and we do feel and we have our emotions. Hi, welcome to Workforce Success Podcast by Mwano Consultancy. I'm here with my colleague Andrea. Andrea, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Awesome. I'm doing great. In our podcast today, we're going to be talking about empathy. And empathy, lately in our culture, empathy is becoming more and more a common word that people are using. But the really interesting part is, what does empathy look like in action? So today we're going to talk about empathy in relation to a workforce environment. My first question to you is, does it matter to work in an environment where empathy is practiced? In Mwano Consultancy, we do a lot of work with different organizations, nonprofit businesses, and we're brought in to help improve the culture and climate of our organization. And often when we're working with partners, we learn a lot that certain behaviors are not displayed and it impacts people negatively. So we have 7 principles that we use as a way of helping our partners. And one of the principles is empathy. So Andrea, does it matter to be in a place where people are practicing and exercising empathy in their everyday experience? Does it matter?
Nah.
I didn't think so either.
Just kidding. No, empathy really is the starting point of a lot of other important work. So without having empathy, you're not able to understand the perspective and the experience of another person. And unless you're doing a job with no customers and no colleagues that you need to interact with, empathy is going to be really critical. So you need to be able to connect with other people, understand what they need from you, whether that's your customer or a peer, a leader, or someone you supervise. And all the work that you're trying to do together is really going to be driven by your ability to understand that person, for that person to understand you, and for them to feel heard and respected, because that's a foundation of effective communication and collaboration.
That's awesome. Well, so from a theory standpoint, that sounds all nice and great and dandy, right? Because a lot of people, this is something that we hear often. People say, it's work, right? You're not trying to be best friends with people. You're going to work. There's a transactional relationship where you get things done, you get paid, and you move on. So for those who say it's work, we don't need to worry about the flowery and the feeling things, because people's feelings changes every day. Doesn't really matter where empathy is displayed or not, you just get work done. So what would you say to that?
It's a common misunderstanding of what empathy is. I think when we hear that type of pushback from folks, there's perhaps an assumption that empathy is about being friends with everybody and singing Kumbaya around a campfire together, and they think, I don't need to do that in order to do my job. And if you can think of empathy as a really critical soft skill and a core ability that is required in effective communication, and you can connect that to the tasks that they need to complete their job, it becomes more relevant and practical. So I think people get stuck when they think of empathy as something that's more social, or it can also feel kind of like an ambiguous term. So maybe not really understanding exactly what is meant about it, not understanding exactly what is meant when you say empathy in the workplace. And we need to make sure that we're able to connect the skill of empathy and the actions that support empathy to the day-to-day work that they're doing, and see how it can actually help them be more effective in their job.
And I would also say, for those who say it's work, your feelings and emotion doesn't really matter, I think that's a coping mechanism, more of a defense mechanism to bypass the reality that feelings and emotion does matter, because we're human beings and we do feel and we have our emotions in everything that we do, regardless if it's there or not. It's still occurring. And in a lot of the work that we do, when we encounter that, we always ask folks, well, there's still a feeling that you have, right? And then some people say, yeah, definitely. And then it's like, well, yeah, so feeling and emotion does matter. And then for those who provide their feedback around where they feel discontent about their work environment, their work culture, a lot of times their reflection comes from descriptions that's describing feelings and emotions. So it's like it does this full circle thing where people start saying, oh, well, emotion doesn't really matter in a work environment. But then when they start giving their example, everything is about feelings and emotion. So I'm curious from your experience, knowing that at Mwano Consultancy, we're working with so many different types of organizations, businesses, nonprofit, and the work environment has different dynamics in terms of folks that are front-facing, folks that are administrative, but I'm interested to know from you, like, what have you encountered in some of the work that you do that has highlighted the importance of an organization actually having realistic strategies behind empathy? So I guess in this question, I want to hear more about like the practical stuff, right? Like, and what does that look like? And how do you all kind of navigate that in the work that we're doing?
Are you talking about strategies to implement empathy into the culture?
Yes.
Okay, so first, it's really important to define empathy for your employees. If you're trying to infuse that into your culture, people need to understand what you're asking of them. And then with that, there might be some training or resources that you'll need to provide your employees. So if some folks are going to already have some skills that are related to empathy, you might have some very naturally empathetic individuals, people who are naturally very curious and relational, who are good at active listening and considering the perspectives of others. You're going to have some employees who don't have those skills, and then there's a spectrum probably. So there's going to need to be some type of mechanism of a skills assessment after you've communicated what the expectations are. I think there's also you can hire for empathy. So if you want to infuse empathy into your culture, you should think about the type of individuals that you're attracting into your workforce, and are you intentionally hiring for empathetic leaders, for example, or empathetic individuals in general at any level of the organization. And then there's also an element of recognition, feedback, oversight, and accountability. So it's really critical that your leaders are on board with the initiative and seeing the value of empathy and how it can improve the work that's being done and the culture. And then they are the first people that need to model empathy, because if people are not recognizing that the senior leaders or their direct supervisor are exhibiting those skills, then they're not going to take it seriously. And at the end of the day, there has to be accountability, and accountability starts from the top. So making sure your leaders are prepared, they are demonstrating the behaviors that you're looking for that support an empathetic culture, and that they're prepared to mentor their teams and help them along towards exhibiting the same behaviors.
So something that we do in our work is anytime we've highlighted an area, if it might be a pain point or even an area that's contributing positively within a work environment, we always try to validate it by bringing it back to our partners to say, ask the employees, especially the leadership team, how do you feel about this? What does this look like? Are you demonstrating this skill sets already? What do you not understand? And what does that look like? How does it get embedded into your everyday practice? And a lot of times what they provide to us in those validation process really tells a lot about where they are and what kind of additional resources we need to do in order to help get them on board. Because a lot of times with some of this concept, we can talk about it from an idea standpoint, or you can even run a really nice training that touches on this stuff, but the follow through is where it struggles. Because people say, oh, these principles are universal enough and we should be acting this way. We should be showing up in a way that it reflects these principles. But then there's never a follow-up after the training in order to see, is it being measured? Do people know how to recognize it? Do you have a validation process where when it's displayed that someone can call it out and say, oh, yes, you did it? Or if it's not being displayed and it's contrary, to say, hey, it's not there. And that's been a lot different for a lot of our work, because what we find working with our partners is that most of the culture and climate stuff from an idea standpoint, people agree on it. Like you get out of a training, like 85%, 95% post survey are like, we believe in this principle, we think it's important. But then you can just leave it at that and you say, oh, I did a great job, we did a great job, we did a training.
Check the box. Yeah.
But in our transformational work, we realize that it's the supplementary work, the content, resources, how you come alongside supervisors, managers, or directors in the behavior will be the thing that's critical. And the thing that you said about leadership being on board and being able to display it is so critical, because most folks are going to look up when it comes to their experience, right? They're going to look at who they're reporting to, how are they displaying it, are they keeping people accountable, are they showing up in a way? And we see that in a lot of our data when we're working with organization, when people say, my leaders, we want to see our leadership display it first if we're going to buy in, or we don't have a problem, it's our leadership. So some stuff that we've done, we work with the partner where we're talking about something simple as saying hello to each other, right? And we talked about the importance of saying hello to each other, with that coming alongside with even your body language, how you're saying hi to people, are you smiling? And it was very silly at first when we brought it up, because people were like, oh, say hello campaign. But the more we started to get to know the larger organization, the more we started to identify how it was critical to be able to, implement something like that, like just acknowledging somebody's existence, when you're working with someone, like how much of that can make a big impact. We also heard in a lot of the survey that people felt that some folks weren't recognized. So I was like, well, if we're going to get into other topics about improving your culture, we're going to have to start with the basics, like saying hi to someone, having a positive body language as you're engaging with somebody. So thank you for highlighting that, because it's a really important part of it, because I think it's the way that I think about a workforce culture. It's very similar to like a home dynamic, right? Mom and dad, or if it's mom and mom or dad and dad, whatever the dynamic of your house is, how they set the tone is how the children will follow along, right? And I think that's a really important example or analogy or metaphor for how it looks like for the bosses and the leadership team, because the rest of the folks are going to follow what they do. So I wanted to shift a little bit in our conversation. The thing is, the biggest question in this work is that you can have somebody who displays positive behavior within a workforce environment that's making a huge impact from a workforce culture, but it's not they're not the highest producer, right? Or they're not the most skillful on certain thing. So does that matter, right? So when you look at when you're looking at your team, the people that make up your team, the different strengths and weaknesses they might have, is it also important to look at how the people that contribute positively in the work environment and the impact that might have on your team versus their production? Meaning, if there's a quota they need to meet, if there's deliverable that they need to meet. Because the reason why I asked that is because I was watching this TV show on Uber, and in the beginning of the interview, this TV show highlights the entire journey of Uber from when it was nothing to Uber blowing up and raising a bunch of money. But one of the things in the interview, the Uber president, CEO, and founder, he would ask people in the interview, he goes, "Are you an asshole?" So, and when he would ask that question, people have to it was interesting, folks would struggle in how they answered it, right? And the thing is, if someone didn't say that they were, or they couldn't have acknowledged that they are, then the CEO and founder didn't feel that person was the right person to work for them. Mm-hmm. And then it's really fascinating because throughout the course of the TV show, you get to see how that mindset focused so much on production than culture, and then eventually everything that played out to the mainstream in terms of Uber's work environment was literally a representation of the tone that they set right from the beginning. I mean, all the sexual harassment stuff and other stuff that they did with their work parties, right? But I just found it to be so fascinating because that literally set the tone of people coming in. Mm-hmm. You know, like, are you an asshole? Like, are you, and then if you're not able to have that honest reflection on it, that would determine if but then later on the show, when employees, specifically female employees, would come up and bring up issues that they were experiencing with harassment or sexual assault, the way that leadership dealt with it was a true representation that production was more important. So there were excuses like, well, this person is our lead director of engineer and they have a big project that they're working on. I definitely agree with you that they shouldn't behave the way that they did, but we need this person, right? And you saw it like throughout the entire series, and it just happened over and over again. And as I was watching it, obviously I had my consultancy culture and climate hat on, and I was reflecting on it. I'm like, holy crap, you already set the tone in the beginning by identifying who you wanted to work for your company, that morality and a positive work environment didn't really matter. Of course, it rippled, like the bigger you got, that became what the DNA of your culture was. And then that was the downfall of Uber, right? Eventually, like there's a bunch of changes that happened. But coming back to you does production matter though, right? When you think about, you might have Joe Schmo, who's like, he's been there for a long time, understands the ins and out of the operation, and they're high producing individual, but their attitude sucks, right? Like when they're around, the pressure that they put on people have anxiety, depression in result of their behavior. But then the company just justifies it because of the return that this person provides. So does it matter? I mean, I'm curious from you. I mean, from a production standpoint, right? Because if you work, there's supposed to be an output. You put in, what you put in, this will be your return, right? That's how a business works. Yeah. So here we are in our space where we're trying to do positive culture environment. Does it matter though? Like realistically though? I'm curious what's your case on it, your point of view on it. I know I kind of gave you a lot, but.
I love this question. And I think it's a really common point of friction when you're doing culture work and you're talking about things like being vulnerable and having empathy and some of these relational skills and elements. And people make an assumption that you do that at the expense of productivity or separately from productivity. And the truth is that empathy done the right way helps you to be more productive and effective. And some of the examples that you gave in that anecdote from that documentary.
It's actually, it's a TV series on Uber. Yeah.
A TV series. When you put productivity over some of these elements, I mean, that sounds like it got to the point where people's employment rights are being violated. So that's the extreme end of the spectrum, where you could also have somebody who's maybe just unpleasant to work with, but gets things done, and what's the impact on the culture and your employees. I had a manager once that told me I was too empathetic, and we created a development goal around managing empathy with my command presence. So some of that friction comes in when you just have different ideas of leadership skills or leadership styles, and someone who is more of a taskmaster or does the command and control, authoritative or transactional leadership, is not going to value the transformational leader or the more empathetic leader, collaborative leadership style. And so part of that development goal, I was asked to meet with one of the leaders in that organization who was a West Point grad, had an incredible resume in leadership, about balancing empathy and command. And one of the things that he said that I've always taken with me from that conversation was, you use empathy to understand what someone is experiencing and to meet them where they are so that you can help them figure out where they need to go. So if you're trying to get a certain task done, let's say you're implementing a new technology system or something, an application, and you need your employees to adopt it and use it. You need to understand what one employee or the next employee needs to adapt that technology. You can't just say, flip a switch, the technology's live, go use it. And what one person needs in that situation might be different from what another person needs. So you leverage empathy by checking in with them, asking them questions, understand what their level of competence is with the task you're asking of them. And then you can meet them where they're at and give them an intervention that will be relevant and help move them forward. So I don't think those two things are working against each other. I think empathy is a necessary component to productivity.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point here, because it never supposed to undermine the actual competency behind the skill set of whatever the duty or responsibility someone has, right? But from a connection standpoint, it is critical in making those authentic connections, especially when you're a leader and you have a team of folks that are behind you, waiting for you, and your body language and how you engage with them is a big factor around that. But at the same time, there is a balance, because there are folks that lead completely with empathy and are afraid at times to keep people accountable. And so there is a balance, right? There is definitely a balance in terms of what are you doing in order to contribute to the overall goal that we have in place in order to produce results, right? And I think the empathy side is about coming alongside each other and getting to know, right? And figuring out and creating a safe space that goes both ways, that people feel that you're present, you're listening to them, that you understand, that you're creating the space to understand who they are. But then the other way around to that is also that those who are on the receiving end of leadership as empathy also have to realize that part of that empathy is to establish, the connection, the authenticity, and creating a safe space where people feel valued, feel respected. But at the same time, the person is still a leader. At times, that person will have to get you going, right? Like direct you, guide you, provide critical feedback. And sometimes folks struggle with that when it's like times where the leader has to wear a different hat in order to help you take ownership around something. And I think a lot of that is really about kind of our environment, our society as a whole, right? Most folks would say in previous generation, there was a stronger emphasis around discipline and this is the lay of the land. Where now folks there's more space for us to be more empathetic with one another. But at the same time, it waters down the accountability side, right? Where it's like, well, I can't, like, even when you look at team sports, right? Like I have younger children and they play, like the whole concept of like everybody gets a trophy so it's like it creates almost this utopia type of environment where folks might lose a sense of accountability, right? So for me, I think it's important that you show up in a way that it's empathetic, but those who are on the receiving end don't take advantage of that, because there is exploitation around those who are empathy, right? Those who have empathetic approach that helps bridge the gap, but then those who are on the receiving end sometimes depict the experience to just be that, right? For the relationship to just be that. And then you come alongside to keep someone accountable, all of a sudden it's like, well, you're not really hearing me out. You're not really understanding my situation. Then it's like, no, I am understanding your situation because I've gotten to know you and I understand you very well. But there's a gap here because your deliverables is not adequate, right? Or your time management is not adequate, whatever the moving parts is. And I think leaders struggle with that. They struggle with that balance. And I think employees also struggle with that balance of maybe the relationship when you first started was predominantly empathetic and now you felt the bond. Oh, they will understand me, or they understand me. But then you use that they understand me as a clutch, right? So you use it as because they understand me, they can allow this to occur or understand why it didn't happen, right? And I don't know if I've seen this in a lot of the work that we do, where examples that we've received from some of the partners that we work with, where it's playing out within its forefront, and you're sitting there, and you're like, well, no, you have to articulate, right? You have to articulate how you're going to show up and what that looks like. But then you also have to articulate the whole concept of accountability, because the accountability has to do with what you need to deliver and provide. So we just went all the way in this, but I think it's important for our listeners to understand that when we are dealing with workforce culture and climate, that we're not just one-sided. And I think that's the very challenging part about doing workforce development or even diversity and equity work within a workforce environment. Because sometimes the expectation that these practitioners might bring are unrealistic to the reality of production or expectation of task and responsibility that people have to do. So then it weighs on one end more than it does on the end of where you do have responsibility and you have to meet the responsibility of the commitment, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's where if you're in a leadership position, if you're a manager, supervisor, you have folks that directly report to you, and part of your role is to manage the work and make sure it's getting done. So when you're in that position, you have leadership expectations and then manager expectations, and in those roles you have to do both. So I think it's important to recognize that it's a collection of skills, and sometimes you're wearing your leadership hat, and that's more about inspiring others and coming alongside someone, helping them see the vision of where we're trying to go, get everybody kind of marching in the same direction. And then also, it's not instead of, it's also managing the work that's getting done and holding accountability. And being able to infuse empathy into that process, I think, to me, that is the bridge between those two concepts, that it really isn't. It doesn't have to be one or the other, that you're not doing empathy one day, but then, I'm going to have to drop the hammer and come back with accountability. It's a process that is infused with both, so that when you have let's say you have an employee with a medical situation or personal circumstances that's impacting their work, and maybe they need to be out of the office more than usual, and the team is saying, well, we're feeling short-staffed. How do you have empathy and understanding and also make sure the work is getting done? And you can do both. And so sometimes, I actually had this conversation recently with one of the leaders that we're doing some coaching with around the quality assurance measures. They do, oversight and give feedback on the quality of the job being done. And this particular team is short-staffed. So we talk about, what is the adjustment of the standard of expectation when a team is short-staffed, but you also can expect the work to be done. So what's the solution? So understanding that they're short-staffed, that's impacting the quality of the work being done. What do they need to meet the expectations and the standards that you've set? You don't have to, one question is, can you adjust your standards and expectations for a period of time? Another question is, if you can't, then do you bring some more people into that team? So you can have empathy and understanding as a way of helping you understand the full situation, instead of just coming in and saying, you guys are doing a terrible job, this is bad work, and getting them in trouble or putting them on a performance improvement pathway, right? That would be a lack of empathy, and it also doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And then your employees don't feel safe, and they don't trust that you're going to see what they need and what they're working with in reality. So empathy can help you understand the situation and respond appropriately, and you can still problem solve and troubleshoot to get the work done that needs to be done.
Yeah, and I think the important thing you just highlighted in that is, in order for it to not be separate, the rule of engagement is actually the glue, right? Like, what's the perimeter in which we're playing in? And sometimes you might need to increase capacity, or sometimes, right? So like, bringing that in there, then it's much easier for you at every moment or every situation. You can still have an empathetic mindset or view in the situation. And I think a lot of that is really about how you communicate, how you set the stage around a conversation. And I feel that in our society, we are more and more afraid to be more direct around certain things, right? So part of it is, if you know the person, if you know the elements that shapes that person, then you have to include that in order to help that they know that you have an understanding of who they are holistically in a situation. And then being able to vocalize where the gaps are or what's occurring that might be preventing that or this. And if there's opportunity to co-design the solution, either from a team standpoint or from an individual standpoint, then welcoming them in that process. But it's really important that when you leave that conversation, that you've established that accountability. What's on you? What's on me? How we're gonna go over this in order to make sure that it's moving accordingly, right? What do you feel comfortable about? What is that like? And I think that's what's missing at times. In a lot of the work that we do, we see that a lot. Like, that particular thing might be playing on someone's head, but they never disclosed it because they were afraid of that uncomfortable conversation. But then they kind of just went along with the conversation, and then they debrief with their colleague about it, but never really debrief with the person that actually needed to hear those parts where it's creating the most friction. So I would say communication and transparency is a critical part of displaying empathy, because it's not just, oh, I have an empathetic approach, so it lives there, versus, because if it lives in your head, then it just lives in your head. If you don't talk about it and bring it up and articulate it, then the other person is not going to understand. I also do think, going back to the receiver, the folks that are on the receiving end, which we all are at times, have to understand that whatever the rule of engagement and commitment is that you have abided to or you say that you're going to do, that is on you, right? Like, if there's an agreement, if you got a chance to voice your opinion and there's an agreement of what next step is, whatever you committed to, you have to do it.
Right.
You know? And if you can't, then it's your responsibility to be able to articulate and communicate it and say, hey, I know last time when we met, this is what you said, but right now I still feel like I don't, or I'm short, or whatever it is. And then, you know what I mean? Because part of it is like, it's ongoing. But what happens is most people don't disclose that. And then maybe you wait and then something falls apart and then you're back in that position again. So I do think that, and that's why in our work, we always say the receiver and the giving. Because there's times where we're on the receiving end of things, and there's times where we're on the giving side of things. And we like to articulate everything that we provide as solutions in that framework, because we want folks to know that sometimes they are on the giving side and sometimes they are on the receiving end. And then for them to be able to identify when they're in it, as they're reflecting on what their responsibility is or the role that they're playing, how are they going to show up in a way that it demonstrates these principles that they're trying to be more attuned to. And with empathy, it's really hard, because it's something that challenges us in every walk of life, not just in our work environment, like in our personal, in our friendship, and our family dynamic, right? So I guess my next question to you is, what are the risks associated to empathy when individuals exploit others? And how can this abuse be prevented? Meaning, maybe you have someone that shows up in the way that's empathetic, or someone who doesn't. When other folks see that and end up exploiting it, what are the risks?
If you have someone who's really empathetic, perhaps we've focused a lot on the direct report and leader relationship. I suppose we can stay there for a moment. It's possible, if you're a leader and you kind of overuse the skill of empathy, your team might be able to take advantage of that. Maybe there's, I was going to say sob story, and that just sounded so unempathetic and judgmental. But if you kind of come up with excuses or reasons why you aren't doing your job the right way, or you know that if you kind of play on someone's empathy a little bit, maybe you can get away with something. Also, if you are kind of an empathetic and open person, sometimes you can be at risk of others taking advantage of you and kind of coming in and taking charge and kind of bowling you over, so to speak. So sometimes if you don't also have accountability and confidence to hold people accountable to certain boundaries, then you might lose a little bit of authority there. I would say that would be like an imbalance of using that skill. And I think it's important to have certain accountabilities in place to make sure that people aren't abusing the system and taking advantage of empathy in that way.
For organizations, there might be some leaders, supervisor, managers, director that are listening to this podcast and are trying to start, but also continue, right? Because what I find is sometimes you hear this thing and you might try it for a little bit and then it kind of just fades away because the everyday, capacity, responsibility just overshadows as you just go back to your old ways of doing things. Mm-hmm. So for those who are trying to start, to be more intentional on leading in a way that's empathetic, but also continue, right? Meaning that it becomes part of their DNA of how they show up and how. What would your recommendation be? Like, what would your tips and recommendation be to them in order for them to start, build traction, and then allow it to be part of who they are as leaders?
Right. So I would say to get started, just do some homework and read up on empathy and how empathy can be applied in the workplace. There are a lot of articles and TED Talks and resources out there that can help you think about what it means to utilize empathy. A really simple way I would suggest is just to ask more questions and create some structure or some type of mechanism to help remind you to show up in that way. So something I've done in the past would be I would have a written agenda somewhere for a meeting, like a one-on-one with somebody, and I would write down the questions that I wanted to ask them related to the topic. So thinking about the questions ahead of time if it doesn't currently come natural to you to be curious. And then challenge yourself to make sure you ask open-ended questions and 1 or 2 follow-ups before you have any opinion that you decide to offer or respond to what they've shared with you. So just asking more questions is a really good way to get started. And then in terms of how do you perpetuate create a habit, basically. You're talking about getting started and then create a habit so that empathy becomes just a part of your leadership style and how you operate. I would say number 1, discuss that openly with your peers and also your team and let them know, I'm exercising this skill. I'm intentionally bringing this into our team culture. And here's what I'm expecting it to look like. What would it look like for you? Invite people into that conversation. And then, because that'll give you a little bit of accountability. And then create checkpoints for yourself. So after a month, 2 months, 3 months, ask for feedback. So 360 feedback can be a really great way to understand how effectively you are meeting your goal of being a more empathetic leader. So get feedback from your team, get feedback from your peers, ask your direct supervisor how you're doing. And if you can bake this work into someone's regular performance review or a development goal, something that is part of a formal structure of accountability and feedback, that will be really critical as well. So it has to be baked into regular checkpoints, resources, and accountabilities with other people in order to create a habit.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea. I know I asked you all the questions in this podcast. Do you have any question for me before we close?
How do you approach empathetic leadership within your own practice as a leader?
Yeah, I think for me, it's interesting because I do think the rules of engagement is really important in how do you set the tone in terms of what the expectations are with people that you're working with or people that you're leading. I think that's really critical. And it starts with definitely having some sort of an alignment around that. And then getting to know the people that I'm working with, kind of their how they express themselves and different aspect of who they are. And then as things are playing out, I think is really important about being able to validate. There might be an indication that I see something or I hear something or even a body language or a tone around someone's voice or email or message, whatever it is. But just being intentional around when you're looking at the work that you're not just looking at the work itself, but you're also looking at the human being behind the work in order to figure out, okay, is there something that I can do to help improve, or is it something that I can articulate? Yes, I do acknowledge if there are friction, being able to acknowledge the friction and creating the space to be able to talk through it. And I think for me, that's like the most impactful way that I've found leading with empathy. And then also like not just waiting when there's frictional opportunity or discomfort to try to address something, but just making it part of the DNA. Because there's a lot of stuff you can do when things are just neutral that will indicate and show to others that you care, right? Because at the end of the day, people want to know that you care. And so for me, it's like just seeking that feedback. I feel like that's like something that I try to utilize a lot. And I always say, like, if I get an inclination that like, oh, maybe this one team member, something is happening, and I say, hey, is everything all right? Can we get on the call? And then I'll say, hey, is this too much? Do you have the capacity for this? Do you understand it? And then just normalizing the challenge, normalizing that, like, hey, it might be a little frictional right now, but like, are you still in control, or do you have the skill set to encounter this, or do you have the time to develop the skill set around this particular thing? Do I need to find somebody else? So I think for me, it's like you alluded to this earlier, constantly engaging in the conversation and not running away from the discomfort. Because a lot of times you can already make decisions prior to that. You can say, oh, this person is not, or this person is this. But I like to come back to the individual and just have the conversation. And then I also think it's like understanding people. Like, you got to understand people. You got to understand where they're coming from. I think the hard part sometimes in experiences that I've had leading is that sometimes folks are also discovering themselves through the process, and they might not have had opportunities to be this intentional with themselves about how they approach work or how they view work. Then along being that honest with themselves to others in terms of how they're encountering their experience. So that's a little hard at times when you're navigating that. And I think for me, it's like, I always trying to figure out, like, what do you want to do? And then when things are not aligning and matching, I like to know, like, what's causing that? Like, what's preventing you from, right? And I'm not passive either. And I think that's the hardest thing for a lot of folks that work with me, even in my family dynamic. Like, I'm not afraid of confrontation or having a positive confrontation around something that's occurring. Like, I actually think that's the norm. Like, the norm is with who you are associated with or you have friendship with, to be able to engage just like you do with the positive stuff or the neutral stuff, to also be intentional in engaging on those discomfort. And it's really hard for a lot of folks that I engage with at times, because at times it feels like I'm too intentional. And the other thing, I think the hard thing for me, that it might be a negative thing sometimes, is that I have a hard time letting go if we haven't come to that intersection of what's the thing. Like, I know you want to move on, right? And we can move on. But if we don't figure out what's the thing that caused this, then it's going to happen again. Right. And most people, they don't want to be in that space of that mirror effect, where they have to look back in the mirror to say, yes, I've named everything that's on you or that was on someone else, and you understand it, and you're showing empathy by acknowledging it, and you have solutions of how we can move forward on it. So let's move on now. Where for me, I'm like, no, but what in this was on you? What did you have ownership that maybe you need to improve and change? That's where the friction occurs. Because, again, like I was saying earlier, I feel like in our society, nobody likes that feeling. But I also know that in a lot of the development that I've had as a human being, the stuff that's helped me to propel forward, it's been actually the areas where I've been humble to admit that I am wrong, right? Where I've said, oh, actually, I definitely dropped the ball. I didn't do that right. Yep, that was my mistakes. And I'm actually a sucker for that. Like, that's actually what drives me in my development as a human being. to be more and more transparent to myself on admitting, yes, that was on me. I dropped the ball. I messed up. All the repercussion of that messing up is what has caused this. And now I got to figure out, what do I need to improve on, and how do I, rebuild the relationships or build the skills that I need in order to improve that thing. Like, that's the stuff to me that I felt like has been actually super critical, because the stuff that you do well in, the stuff that you do in autopilot, like, you're going to be a rock star no matter what. It's the stuff that you fall short on various things, from a relational standpoint, from a companionship standpoint, from a reliance standpoint, accountable. Those are the things that I feel like is so important. So a lot of times, I have to wrestle with it. I have to wrestle with that a lot. But I feel like the more as a leader I lean towards that, the better that I become. And I feel like even more and more in where I am now, I'm actually running more towards, like, let's talk through this. Like, if I want to know if I dropped the ball, like, that's the thing that I'm actually like running towards, because the stuff that I might be good at is the stuff that maybe I have an understanding that's created a pathway to where I might be today. But it's the stuff that I still need work on, is the stuff that I need to put the spotlight on. So I think, but part of it's also a journey, right? It's an ongoing journey. It never ends, and people change too. So that's the other thing. Like, if you're working with somebody for a very long time, there might be personal thing that's happening in their life that has changed who they are. So empathy and how you show up as a leader might look different for that person in this season now, right? Mm-hmm. Because they might be going through their own hardship that requires adaptability, right? And I think, that happens in personal relationships all the times, where people are not the same people they were 5 years or 10 years ago or 2 years ago, or when you guys were in high school. So, and being able to have that adaptability is, like, I think it's really important. But there still are the bottom line, right? Yeah. And this is the thing I tell a lot of our partners is, like, we're not here naive to what your output is supposed to be, or what you're striving for your output to be. We want to help transform your culture so that people can respect each other, value each other, and feel that they're in a safe space, so they can meet the output expectation that you want. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to do this in a silo. We're not going to come here and just do a revolution just for the sake of a revolution and people feel good. And for our listeners, if you're listening, please share, provide us some feedback, and we're excited for this. And we hope what we provide to you, you can take it, apply it in your everyday responsibility and work and your team dynamic in order to improve how you lead.